Welcome to the inaugural flight of the new podcast from Erskine Parish Church. It is loosely titled Exploring Practical Christianity, and that's basically what I hope to do in this. This will be a place where I'll deal with questions that come up that aren't always directly addressed in the sermon or in the series of sermons, and which might even go into a bit more time, background, and detail of stuff we've been looking at, but it'll deal with very practical topics. I've got a big list of topics that I'm going to take on, things to do with salvation, what happens in the afterlife, mostly compiled from questions I get asked and fired at me either in person or online. But I thought for this inaugural one, it would be good to recap and hopefully provide a really practical guide to prayer for folks. Now, I've recently did a sermon series on prayer. We've just finished one on the Lord's Prayer and how Jesus teaches us to pray. I did that for, I hope, a very good reason, that's something that I get asked about the most. And that's something that quite often when these things are assessed, people say that they're lacking the most confidence in. Folks in church, folks who are looking to grow and develop their faith, they say, I would like to know a bit more about how to pray. That comes up again and again. I've done it for that reason, to equip people, but also my hope would be that if you're somebody who's wanting to get better or more structured with praying personally in your own life, that'll be helpful, but also that'll be helpful if you're wanting to know how you could write a prayer for, or prepare a prayer for public worship, for any of the slots that we have in public worship. I've done my best to structure this so that it recaps everything that we've learned, or the main points that we've learned about prayer from the Lord's Prayer. And I'm going to package that in such a way towards the end where you'll be able to see where that would fit in writing prayers for a liturgy, for a public worship service. So what would we call this one? Let's call this one Encouraged to Pray Confidently. I'm trying to make things stick as memorably as I can and playing around with the EPC, because that's the name of our church, Erskine Parish Church. So I've broken this into 5 parts. We are going to start with what we learned about approaching God in the Lord's Prayer. We're then going to go on to then submitting to God's will through prayer. We're going to talk about asking for stuff, which is a big part of the prayer, confessing, and forgiveness and grace. And then we'll kind of try and bring all that together. So if you want any more detail on any of these, you can go back and listen to our sermon series. You can get all the sermons that we've done on the Lord's Prayer, either on our Spotify channel or on our YouTube. They're all kind of clipped and ready to go there. But let's do this. I'm hoping that if you could save this podcast, and if you're wanting, you can have it as a companion. If you want to remember what are the kind of component parts of prayers, what are the different prayers that we do, different reasons for them. The Lord's Prayer is really good because it acts as a template. Now, many Christian traditions have been, whether it's Reformed, Orthodox, Catholic, for centuries have been saying the Lord's Prayer as it is 3 times a day as part of their liturgy. If you do that, that is great. But whenever you look into the kind of commentaries and you study the way Jesus taught his disciples to pray, it seems that he was giving them a kind of a template, if you like. He's saying these are the kind of important marks to hit in prayer, and you can use them as you would like to yourself. And others have written on that. The likes of Tim Keller's got a great book on prayer where he again goes through a lot of the structure of the Lord's Prayer and fleshes it out. Martin Luther, the German monk and reformer, did this a lot, and he wrote on this a lot, using these parts of the Lord's Prayer as a template. I like the picture of the Lord's Prayer as a house full of different rooms. And I opened our sermons with that on this, that it's as if it takes you into a big grand mansion, and there are lots of different rooms of prayer that you visit as you're praying in different ways and for different things. So let's get right into it and think about our first area of prayer that the Lord's Prayer really teaches us about, and that Jesus teaches his disciples about in Matthew chapter 6. And it's approach, or approaching God specifically in prayer. Now, approach is really important. It's, if you like, the beginning. It's how we all start. When you go to strike up a conversation with someone, it's something like, hello, how are you? How's it going? If it's with God, then most of us have got usually a slightly more formal language that we use. But well, why do we approach God in a certain way, and what's the point in it? Well, this is, if you like, if the house is different rooms in terms of our prayer, this is the front entrance, this is the vestibule, this is the front door that you go in, and you're considering, how am I gonna address God? So, our Lord taught us to say, "Our Father, which art in heaven," or, and I love the translation, "Our Father in the skies." It's an acknowledgement that God is above us. And if you like, that sets us up to remember kind of who we're praying to and what the point of prayer is. We're praying to somebody who is by nature different and outside of ourselves, and we are directing everything we're going to say to them. The way Jesus opens his prayer, it seems, comes from the Kaddish, which was a common Jewish prayer at his time, which talked about exalting and hallowing the name of Yahweh and praying for his kingdom to reign forever. So Jesus seems to have riffed on that and done his own thing with it. Titles for God are important. Sometimes they get a bit of ridicule that, people just rhyme off meaningless titles for God, but it's actually an important part of worship, is approaching God in prayer and ascribing things to him that we know to be true about him. So that's why you'll hear people say things like everlasting, ever loving, most merciful God, and of course, most holy God. That's why Jesus says, "Hallowed be thy name." That does a few things. In one sense, it praises God and it brings us into that rhythm of what we've actually been made for. We all through one of the things we pick up in the grand story of the Bible is that we are made to worship and adore and praise God. That's one of the things we're designed for, if you like. And approaching God in prayer is definitely a part of that. So it's coming and addressing God. And that is a way of, if you like, centering us as well and getting us in the kind of posture and the frame of mind of going, okay, I'm talking to a high and a holy God who is outside of me and not like me. And that should be a comforting thing as well, because we are bringing what we're about to say to the one who rules and reigns in the universe. And so we approach God with that sense of awe and reverence, but also with a sense of intimacy. The very first word that Jesus uses is Abba, Father, which was a term of connection, of family, of familiarity. Not, of course, over familiarity, but indeed it's meant to draw us into the fact that we've been invited to connect with a God who we know has shown his love for his creation, for his creatures, for humanity, and of course, specifically for us. And so we take some time to think, how are we going to approach God? What are we going to say to frame our prayer? If our prayer is going to be really focused on love and the need for love in our own hearts in the world, then we would maybe say most loving and merciful God. If we are wanting to focus on how we need the power of God to act, we would maybe say everlasting, all powerful God, most holy God. All of these things, if we're more crafting a prayer, then that would be the kind of thing we'd have in mind in our approach. But also, there are no rules around this. All these things are given for our help and instruction. It's right to bring any of those praiseworthy terms to God. So that's approaching God. Then we move on to submitting, coming into line with God's will and God's ways. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. Why does Jesus say, thy kingdom come? If you like, the ministry and life of Jesus is about the meeting point of heaven and earth in the person of Jesus. He is the one who says that the kingdom of God is at hand and it's already coming and it's here. Now, of course, we do not see in Jesus' time, or indeed ours yet, the full universal reign of God where all sin, evil, darkness, injustice is driven back. But that's one of the things that Jesus encourages us to pray for. And if we're ever stuck for what to pray for, it's always appropriate to ask that God's will would be done. And particularly the way God reveals himself to be to us, his loving nature, his goodness, his peace, justice, mercy, and truth, that more and more of that would be seen all throughout our world, which so badly needs it. And so it's for God's rule and reign to come in the whole world, but also specifically the way Jesus characterized this is in our hearts. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. We are people who dwell on earth and we take up space and inhabit earth. And a big part of this prayer is, if you like, getting our will to submit to God's will. That's what a lot of prayer is. We'll come on later to asking God for stuff and the importance of doing that. But prayer quite often is a spiritual and a sacred place where we meet with God, and where, although we ask Him to change things and it's right to do that, we also find in that space God molding us towards His will and what He wants to happen. And it's possible for God's will to be done in our hearts and in our lives. We've got plenty of resources in the New Testament, particularly, that shows us that God is willing to give us a spirit and to show us what is good and pleasing to Him. So it's a good thing to pray, God, your will be done in my heart and life, and also in the hearts and lives of others, and of course in the world at the highest level of government and authority. May your will be done. May your goodness and truth and justice, mercy, and beauty be seen and done in other people, even as it is in your realm of heaven. Heaven isn't just a place far away in the skies. Heaven, the idea of it in the New Testament is more like the place of God's uninterrupted rule, the space that God inhabits with all His attributes as well. So that's submitting or coming into line with God's will. It's an important aspect in prayer that sometimes even happens when we're not trying to get anything to happen, just by saying what Jesus prayed, nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. It's amazing how that can change things in our own lives and hearts. And then we come on to, we've done submitting and coming into line. Then we come on to asking for stuff. And give us this day our daily bread. And of course, this is really practical, really down to earth. This has probably been the most common prayer that's been said in all of human history, because for a lot of human history, people have lived with scarcity and a lack of resources and in some level of poverty. It's perhaps less commonly said in desperation in our modern Western culture, because we have in so many ways, we've got so much more. But that's not to say that we don't have needs. As human beings, we are limited and not all powerful. And so we continue to have needs, and we're encouraged by God to ask for stuff, to ask for what we need. If you like, the heavenly and the God's kingdom kind of ideas onto the very earthly, practical, and our individual lives, but also our communal lives as people and creatures. And John Calvin likened this to a bit like the two tables of the law that Moses was given. And the first part is really about right worship of God, and the second table was about right relationship with each other. And this is about how we exist and how we get what we need to exist in this world. And it's all in the context of God's fatherly kindness and very much His concern with our material and bodily needs. Sometimes there can be a temptation in prayer to over spiritualize it to the point where we wonder if God is really all that bothered with our material needs, whether that's our bodily needs, our financial needs, whether that's the things that we're worried about that are that young people we know are going through in school, or that people are suffering and struggling with at work. Definitely mental health I would put into this category, the peace and the positivity that we need in order to survive those battles. Give us what we need, enough provision. And it's interesting because it draws on a motif that goes all the way through the Bible of having enough. There's equal and opposite dangers in the Bible from having, abject poverty is always going to make us struggle to focus on anything else, really. And so God is a God who reveals Himself to be one of provision, but also there's enormous dangers with having copious amounts of wealth and provision and more than we know what to do with. And that might be a prayer that's more relevant probably in our times, that people would have enough, a bit like the story of the manna in the wilderness in Exodus, where God provides just enough, and anything that people gather that's out of kind of greed or excess is spoiled. This is a really powerful prayer to bring to God. Just go, God, give me enough, and also give us enough, provide for what we need. If you're doing this in a kind of a church-wide context and setting, it's praying, God, uh, give us what we need as a church, whether that's financially, materially, resources, people, manpower. God is to bring these things to God. Sometimes we omit or think, oh, maybe God's not that bothered, or maybe my prayers aren't going to be holy, or I'm not going to ask for the right spiritual things. God is able to handle all those requests. And I think he would, through Jesus' example, caution us to err on the side of asking with too much detail and too much specificity for what we need, rather than to be too abstract. So it's to bring to God what we, and specifically what others need. This is a great one to remember, that there are people who are really hard pressed and really need. So whether that's the needs of world poverty and hunger, how that's affecting people, for those needs to be alleviated through acts of gospel mercy, through other means and NGOs, through even just the miraculous God moving around of resources. It's to pray for what people need, asking for stuff. Now, the next part is confessing. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. So let's just focus about the fact that we're coming to God in the first part of clause of that, saying, forgive us our debts. The idea is that sin puts us into debt with God. And the sort of word that's used for debt and sin is pretty close there. There's a very common idea that sin is dead, and dead is sinful. And that goes back to the Old Testament as well, because it's essentially to not have what you need to get bailed out of the situation that you're in, to be at the mercy of someone else. It's basically encouraging us to come regularly and to clear that account with God, with again the assurance that our God is a loving and forgiving Father who longs and loves to do this. Sometimes we can be a bit squeamish about that, but the church has understood the power of confession, again, for many, many centuries, that there is a spiritual reality that in coming before God and confessing to Him directly, where we know we've gone wrong, the things that are burdening us, that have troubled our conscience, that have started to stack up and really give us a hard time, that God promises in confessing that and bringing that to Him, that it gets cleared away. We can have a human instinct to kind of hide. You see that in Genesis 3, after man and woman sin and fall, they kind of sew the fig leaves together because they're essentially they're in that psychological space where they think, if I could cover myself, I could hide from God, that would be a better thing. And God kind of gently draws us away from that and asks us rather to come to confess it with the assurance and the promise of His nature and how forgiving He is. I love the way Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son and the, if you like, the scandalously loving father. And I think he tells that story so that we have that picture in our mind, that it doesn't matter where we've been, what we've done, how far we feel like we've strayed from the path, that the picture God gives us of Himself as a father through Jesus is running to meet the person who's coming back saying, I'm sorry, I've got it wrong, I've messed up. It's good for our humility too, to continually be in the practice of going, I have and we have got it wrong. G.K. Chesterton said that sin might be the only part of Christianity that's absolutely scientifically, observably provable and true, because we are all sinners. We do all sin continually. And from a church leadership point of view, or leading in worship, this is something that's a big part of our liturgy, is our prayers every week of confession and adoration, which we always end with the Lord's Prayer. It's something that I really miss now if I go to a service and I don't have it and it's not there, because it's part of our clearing the dead cycle, of our cleansing our soul, of our getting right with God. It not only reminds us that we're not perfect and that we need God, but it brings us that lovely assurance of God has dealt with that. On the cross, Jesus died to pay for and forgive all my sin, to cancel the record of debt that stood against me and anybody that prays this prayer, and to bring me back into harmony and connection with God. So it's really, really important part is the a confession, and it can take so many forms. We obviously sin in thought, word, and deed, And it can be just what's burdening us. But if we're leading others in prayers, it can be what we know are, if you like, the besetting sins of our culture. It can be sins of both omission, what stuff we've left out, and commission, stuff that we've done that we know that we shouldn't have. And always with the assurance that God is able to handle whatever it is that we say to him. And it's a safe and a sacred space. Confession. And lastly is forgiveness and grace. Now, that prayer is forgive us our debts, or as we forgive our debtors, the other people who've wronged us and who, if you like, in our debt. And that's an encouragement to, this is something that's, you're praying it, but it's got an expectation that you'll live it out practically, is as you're praying it, that you will also give out the forgiveness and the grace that you've been shown. This is an encouragement to really practice the idea of Jubilee from the Old Testament, where every 7 years debts were cleared, and then 7 times 70, there was a great celebration on the 50th year, where, if you like, the whole economy was reset from the burden of slavery, and particularly indentured servitude and debt slavery. We don't have that kind of cultural setup now, but we do know what it is to have people who uh, do things wrong against us, sin against us. And this is saying, look, as you've received the grace and the love and the power of God to forgive you of all your sin, that can flow in and through you and then back out of you, and you're able to forgive others. But I think this is something that's important to pray for the power to do it, because not all of us find forgiveness easy. But if God's asking us to do something, it's implicit that he can and will supply the power to do it. So this is an important part. Yes, we're expected in the prayer, as we forgive our debtors, that we will do it. But I would say it's always appropriate to pray to God, God, give me the power to forgive that person. I bring you the hurt and the difficulty that they've brought me, and I'm asking you to deal with it. Because the word that Jesus uses in the New Testament for forgive is basically to release or to let go. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to become best pals with everyone. It doesn't mean that there can't be trust and boundary issues. None of that. What it is saying is that you've released them to God's grace or judgment or whatever it is, but that it's released out of our grip and hands. You know, like when you're holding onto a piece of paper, and you're grasping it so tightly that it's starting to disintegrate. This prayer is the invitation through God's grace to experience what he's done for us and allow that to open and release our grip and let whatever that is flow off into the wind of God's good wisdom, judgment, and dealing with. And there's something so freeing and releasing if we're able to do that, even though it is hard. But I would add into this that we should be in the kind of rhythms of grace as people who've experienced God's goodness and love. And so this is an invitation to pray that that grace would continue to flow through the world, that people would cancel each other's debts, that situations in the world that are full of tension, conflict, hatred, and animosity and suspicion, that they would be alleviated by God's grace and forgiveness and love continuing to flow through and to touch different people. So let's have a little bit of a summary of where we've been, and if we put that all together, how Jesus teaches us to pray. We began with adoration, or if you like, approaching God and focusing on things that are true about him, whether it's holiness, his goodness, his power. And we do that to give us a sense of reverence, but we also do it remembering he is our loving Father who calls us into relationship to talk to him in the space of prayer. We then look to align our hearts, our will, our emotions with that of God's. We look to kind of come under his rule and reign by submitting, that his kingdom would come, that his ideas would prevail rather than our own. We're looking to align our wills with God in prayer. We then move on to asking for stuff, whatever it is we need or people around us need. God wants to hear about what it is we need. And so that's where in our kind of prayer life in publicly in the church, that's what we call intercession, or even some people call it petition. We confess, we acknowledge our sinfulness, the fact that we strayed from the path, and we look towards God's full and free forgiveness of us to correct that and to clear our account. But then, having received that, we also look for us to be participants in God's forgiveness of others, but to show them God's love, grace, and mercy. And we look for that increasingly in the world to make it a better place. In our church and in many Church of Scotland and traditional Reformed liturgy, we have this split into two prayers in our church. Our first one is adoration and confession. So it draws on what we learned about the approach to God and on the confessing part, having an idea of God's will then as well, God's kingdom to come in ourselves and in others. And then our second prayer is always one of intercession or petition. It's the asking God for our needs and for the needs of others and for the needs of the world. Now, the one I've kind of left out that doesn't actually fit in any of these, sometimes people are given an acronym called ACTS to pray, and I think that originates from like the 19th century, and that can be really helpful for people if they're trying to think, well, how would I structure a prayer? That is adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and a very old-fashioned word, supplication, which is asking for stuff. But again, that's a different way of squaring the same thing, because if I think about that in our church, our first prayer would be adoration and confession. So that's the A and the C. And the second prayer would be thanksgiving, giving thanks to God for all the good things that we have, and supplication or intercession, or basically asking for stuff, giving thanks and then asking God for the stuff that we need. We also have a tradition of and some places do this completely separately, of dedicating our offering then. But it's part of the same thing. It's thanking God that we've been able to offer something back to him and his work and his kingdom. And it's asking that we'll be able to continue to do so. So acts can be helpful, remembering to adore God, worship him and confess our need, and then also to, in the next prayer, to thank him and ask him for stuff. Ultimately, this is just one framework. It's a really solid one, though, that people have been using in the church for a long time. And Jesus packs into that teaching and Sermon on the Mount a really comprehensive way that if we follow it in any measure, we'll find that we have something really useful to be able to pray to God. This is all framed in the context of God's loving fatherly care of us and his invitation and desire that we come and pray. Prayer changes things. Prayer changes us. I hope some of you have got testimonies and experiences of the times where you've prayed and where it's really made a difference, because ultimately that's what we're looking for and that's what we need to hang on to. It can become burdensome. We can easily fall into the trap of finding it weary to pray, or mystifying or bewildering, or even wondering what is the point. But I would always say that the life and teaching of Jesus is our supreme example, and he is the Son of God, modeled that dependence on prayer, but also the power and the fruitfulness of prayer by coming to God, by approaching him within fatherly relationship, by looking to come into his will and what he wants done in the world, and to be an agent of that, even in prayer, looking to bring our needs and the needs of others before God, looking to bring him our sense of unworthiness and debt, and asking for his full and free forgiveness, and looking for his help to extend that grace, love, and mercy out into the world. I hope that's helpful. I hope this will be something you'd be able to put on the shelf and come back to if you ever need it. It's a summary of about 5 or 6 different sermons that I've rattled through in the time it would normally take me to do one. But please, on the back of this, if you have further questions that might work well for a follow-up podcast, you can do that. And you can also, as I said, find all the sermons at our YouTube and Spotify. Thank you. God bless.